43, Hegel. Oh, wonderful. So paragraphs 42 and 43, Hegel really goes over why mathematical thinking and postulation, it's useful, but that's not how philosophy works. I'm wondering how Spinoza does differently. And I just sort of levitated towards Euclid's fifth postulation, I believe, that really got attacked in recent mathematical, I say recent, like 20th century circles and 21st century circles, where they sort of work beyond Euclidean geometry. And that, okay, so essentially the thing is two parallel lines are parallel to each other and they go on forever, they never meet. But when you take that to the world, they actually do meet because the world's a sphere. And so non-Euclidean geometry gets born from that. So the reason I brought that up was I'm wondering if Spinoza somehow escapes that sort of diversion. And of course, we can't really talk about that now because we haven't read the ethics. So I guess that was just something interesting to me.
Yeah, I think those sort of notions of non-Euclidean geometry are kind of interesting in the context of Hegel, because that's a big thing about Kant, because he made a big deal about essentially his idea of science is kind of Newtonian, though not exactly, but for the most part. And also it's this idea of math and geometry is Euclidean. It is another way of saying basically Newtonian also. But then his idea is that, you know, there's this, it's this kind of universal thing, you know, that that, you know, you go to whatever, New Zealand or something, I don't know, just random example, people are gonna have the exact same kind of mathematical structures of, you know, the transcendental mind doing its Kantian thing. But then the problem immediately becomes that, okay, well then something people are discovering or creating, I don't know, non-Euclidean mathematics that seem to correspond to better to actual existing things, I guess you'd say, actual existing space, or it's kind of a weird notion, but yeah, so it seems like Hegel has a kind of understanding of how those transitions could work. And I think he actually kind of suggests something like that. I can't remember where, but he talks about, so I think it's somewhat towards the end of where he's talking about all the mathematics stuff. And he's talking about also, you know, the understanding or clever argumentative reasoning too, as something, you know, it just sees things as opposed. It has kind of one abstract universal idea of something. You know, this is like Kant saying that, you know, this particular modality of, you know, geometric reasoning, this matrix of, you know, transcendental possibilities thrown on everything, that's universal. But then the thing is that I think what Hegel would really want to say from that is that that universal isn't fully developed, and instead we need to, well, basically, because it's not fully developed, it's going to have some kind of contradiction with itself. So instead, it just needs to fully develop itself and move beyond itself by doing that. And then I think you could say, okay, well then, is non-Euclidean geometry basically is that what it is? But then that's kind of interesting, because you could say then, okay, we see this happening in mathematical science, but then he's also saying that mathematical science has these limitations. It's not, you know, science in his sense of Wissenschaft, you know. So it's kind of interesting that I wonder if he was aware of non-Euclidean ideas, and if that, you know, would that maybe change his point of view of mathematics and its limitations and all that, or not? I'm not sure, but yeah.
I was thinking with respect to that, I have a feeling that to a certain extent, non-Euclidean, the discovery of sort of non-Euclidean geometries would probably just reinforce Hegel's criticisms in the following sense. I'm kind of thinking of the sort of criticisms of scholasticism. What is the joke? There was the two monks in a monastery getting into an argument over the number of teeth in the mouth of a horse. And one of them, said, well, I've read Aristotle, and Aristotle says there's however many number, I don't remember what it was. And the other one said, well, I've read Aquinas, and Aquinas said a different number. And so they're arguing back and forth. Well, Aquinas says this. Aristotle says this. And a third monk comes along and goes, well, what if we just, there's a stable outside, there's some horses in there, we could just go look at the horse, open its mouth, and count the teeth, right? And they both shut him down, right? They were like, no, that wouldn't prove anything. It's all about who's right between Aristotle and Aquinas. It seems to me that there isn't any way within mathematics that you could have produced non-Euclidean, like the non-Euclidean recognition, specifically because it's like they just always began with a postulate, right? And so you need some sort of reason, or you need to suspect, right, external to mathematics, that mathematics is wrong about the necessity of this axiom. And then if you suggest the non-necessity of this axiom, then you can explore that possibility, and you can see what non-Euclidean mathematics look like. So what I would guess Hegel would say is that this is something that it's not necessarily produced through observation by going and looking at the horse, but it is something that has to be produced through speculative philosophy that isn't necessarily mathematical, or that's what I would think Hegel would say.
Just as a matter, I think I've got this right, because let me turn off my phone, sorry. At St. John's, they went through this thing when we were talking about geometry. So my understanding is the way that non-Euclidean geometry originated. I was just looking up, one of the guys that developed it was named Lobachevsky, and he died in 1856. And another guy was named Bolyai, and he died in 1860. So they were, in that. So when did Hegel die?
Or 1850.
Okay, so they were contemporaries. I don't know whether he knew of it or not, but my understanding of the way they came up with it is, the parallel postulate that Jackson was talking about was a postulate. It was no one even ever tried to prove it, because it was, Euclid just laid it down as a postulate. And even though it's a pretty complex postulate, you would expect it to be a theorem instead of a postulate. And so my understanding of what happened was, I think this is Lobachevsky's version, what he tried to do was prove, rather than accept it as an axiom, he tried to do a reductio ad absurdum proof of the fifth postulate. And the way he did this was, he said, if you have two lines that are parallel, or let's say you have two lines and you cross them with a third that is at right angles to both of those, what he said is, let's assume there's a small angle between that top line and another line called the angle of parallelism. It's a very small angle, but let's assume that no line within that angle, that there's no line within that angle ever touches the other line. So in other words, there's a whole continuum of lines that are less than 90 degrees from that top angle that nevertheless never meet and what he was expecting to get is a contradiction, because he was expecting to say, well, obviously the parallel postulate is correct. And so that when I make this non-Euclidean assumption, I will end up getting a contradiction, and that will prove that it is true. And we can, instead of saying it's a postulate, we can say it's a theorem. But instead of getting a contradiction, he got an entirely new, legit, equally valid system of non-Euclidean geometry. And so it wasn't that he started off exactly doubting it. He started off assuming it was true, trying to prove it was true by reductio, and ended up developing an entirely axiomatically, what would be the word, sound, at least valid system of geometry. And so I don't know how that would change, how Hegel might view it. I mean, I think Kant, he assumes that our intuitions are Euclidean. And I don't know if there's other, like Chase was saying, I don't know if there are other cultures that have non-Euclidean geometric intuitions. But if it's true that that rational beings always have Euclidean intuitions, that would not violate Kant's claim. But if you then go and say, however, the universe has non-Euclidean features, that then says that human rationality is not perfectly matched with phenomenal reality. And it seems like that would be a problem for Kant, because he thinks that those structures built into the transcendental ego are in fact what construct the world. But then maybe Kant could make a distinction between the world as of perception, which is based on the transcendental ego, and I don't know what I don't know what Kant would say about that. But there are people that say that and incidentally, non-Euclidean geometry was discovered way before relativity. And so non-Euclidean geometry was already around when Einstein came up and said, oh, by the way, the universe is not Euclidean. So those tools were already in place. They did not come about as a consequence of his insights. He was able just to apply them. And so, but what does it mean after Einstein to say that the universe, at least on the large scale, is not Euclidean, but our spatial intuitions, at least in Western culture, do seem to be Euclidean? I'm not sure how Kant would answer that, and I'm not sure what Hegel would say about that either.
I mean, there's a more explicit, or well, maybe not explicit, but a more direct example of that insofar as it's pretty well established at this point through like psychological testing that that Aristotelian physics are like intuitive to the human mind. Like your brain assumes that the world operates according to Aristotelian physics. And even people who've been trained in Newtonian physics and know that Newtonian physics is the correct answer and is a better, well, it's a correct answer, right? Technically, it's been it itself has been demonstrated as incomplete via Einsteinian physics, but it's a better explanation of what's going on than Aristotelian physics. If you force people who've been trained in Newtonian physics to make snap decisions or like give snap answers to questions regarding the movement of objects, they'll default to Aristotelian assumptions. So it definitely seems like it's the case that human beings have faulty or incorrect assumptions about the nature of reality built in as assumptions into their mind. But yeah, in terms of what Hegel or Kant either, I mean, well, maybe we can puzzle out what Hegel would say about it based on what we've read, or what we will read. But it certainly seems like Kant doesn't really have, I mean, he can tell us that, well, of course, there's a difference between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. And insofar as like our mind is structuring things, it doesn't necessarily tell us what the nature of the world is. But then it seems interesting that phenomenality is itself like doesn't match with our transcendental ego, right? So then like I can get evidence that my transcendental ego is wrong about the world in my perceptions, which is totally, it seems like it somehow breaks Kant.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. I think that's it does pose a difficulty for Kant. I want to say Nevitt's description of how non-Euclidean geometry was first like developed out of a problem within Euclidean geometry it sounds to me like it vindicates Hegel. I don't know what Hegel's stance per se on Euclidean geometry is, but the movement from Euclidean geometry to non-Euclidean geometry, and it sounds like it was basically imminent, right? It's according to the terms of geometry. And I want to say also probably another thing that Hegel, I suspect, as far as I understand, would add is that inherent in the idea of geometry itself is an external reality. Like and then historically it comes from, measuring land, for agrarian purposes and dividing it in a society. So there's already this outside itself that is integral to the idea of what geometry is. And if along the way it proves to be more and more sufficient to the tasks it sets itself and it develops, then you would expect that at some point, some of these internal contradictions or missteps that it may have made at the beginning are going to manifest in error, trying to project two parallel lines onto a curved surface or, things like that. So that eventually you have to, according to terms imminent to geometry itself, discover the error and then rectify the error with a different version. Again, it sounds to me like we have geometry, which is at one time canceled and retained, lifted up to a higher plane in recognizing the outside of itself that is at the same time integral to itself, and then and taking this into itself. I want to say this is a really good demonstration of what Hegel's trying to, what his project in the Phenomenology is just give us an account of consciousness developing, according to, internal immanent dynamics. And then to that effect, I wanted to say, with this overall picture now we have of the development of geometry, the picture that our comprehension of a historical progress in a field is not itself mathematical, right? We don't tell a history of geometry in geometric terms. And I think that's kind of what more or less a large part of what Hegel's getting at here in this last part of the preface is that, up to this point, a lot of times people have kind of, I don't know if this is the best term, but hypostasized the methods of the mathematics especially, and natural sciences, and saying this is what clear thinking is, and this is what a philosophy should aspire to. And I think Hegel's kind of pointing out a problem with that, and that if you limit yourself this way, then what you're doing is you're kind of, more or less limiting yourself to formalisms, and that's not really where even thinking comes from. And philosophy is always engaged, in a back and forth between formalisms and the world that the formalisms is meant to describe. And geometry has this, has to have a back and forth between formalisms and the world it's meant to describe, right? But geometry can't tell the story of its development. Philosophy can tell the story of its development, if that helps.
Well, I have so many questions about this section, which makes me kind of fall into despair, because I can't imagine. I can imagine I'm only going to get even more as we go through. But the one thing that I seem to gather, I think, and you or maybe Hunter can tell me that I'm wrong, but the one thing I seem to get when I'm looking at what he says about mathematics compared to what he, like Chase said, what he called a proper scientific view, which is what he calls philosophy. Testing my own contradictions, is that the mathematics and logic and formal logic have a certain necessity to them, in the sense that, if you have these two premises, if P is true, then Q is true, and P is true, then it's logically necessary that Q be true. That's a kind of necessity. And there's sort of a logical necessity that 2 + 3 = 5, and that the longest side of a triangle is opposite its largest angle, and all that. But I think on my reading, what Hegel is saying is those necessities are external to the ideas themselves. They are sort of logical impositions that a certain kind of logical thinking imposes on external, or on a body of knowledge that is sort of external. And what he seems to be saying is that this dialectical logic, the necessity is internal to the, I'm not sure what to say, the concept or the entity itself. And so it's an imminent necessity that is not the external imposition of a logical form onto something. That's why I was saying, like in our Discord thing, why this reminds me of Bergson, because he seems to be saying you take this abstract mathematical, let's say Euclidean frame, and you impose it on a structure. That frame is external to the structure, and you can use it to figure out mathematical necessities, but those are externally applied logical necessities, whereas he thinks that actuality has an internal dialectical logic, and therefore why do you not need, like in Euclidean geometry, you've got to have definitions and axioms or postulates, and then you can start proving things. And as Euclidean geometry shows, if you start with different postulates, you end up with different geometries, and they're equally necessary in terms of pure logic. But I'm wondering if Hegel would say that's because you're, again, imposing these external logical forms onto things. Whereas if you can find the internal implicit dialectical developmental logic that actually governs dynamic actuality as opposed to static geometric structures, then that necessity is not, you don't have to have postulates and definitions, because it's this thing working through its own necessary developmental process that is unfolding in this sort of necessary way. I mean, I can say that, and I don't know what that means in practice, and I can't give you any examples, but that seems to be the big difference, is this internal necessity that is true necessity, according to Hegel, because it is constitutive of the process of actual existence itself, which is always a dynamic, flowing, and moving thing, as opposed to these external, rigid, static, timeless, non-moving, non-process logical and mathematical structures that we jam onto things to try to make them static and make them stay still. And that's the one big takeaway I got from this section. Other than that, I've just got lots and lots and lots and lots of questions of words and ideas I just don't understand. And there's so many. I could direct you to one of them, but there are so many, I don't even know where to start.
Maybe just, you go on, Chase.
No, Jackson, go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned Bergson earlier, and as I iterated in the Discord, I really thought so too, and I thought it really reverberated in paragraph 43. Just going to read a little bit. Let's see. In mathematical cognition, insight is an external doing vis-a-vis the item at issue. It follows that the true item at issue is thereby altered. The tools, the construction, and the proof thus do indeed contain true propositions. However, it must nonetheless be stated that the content is false. The triangle in the above example is taken apart, and its parts are then affixed onto other figures that the construction which is contained in the triangle permits to emerge. So you're definitely right that with Hegel, he envisions that when we do problems with the right triangle, like, what's the cosine of 45 degrees, etc., that you're externalizing it and you pick apart an abstract, much like how Bergson said how an artist may sketch one side of Notre Dame, but you aren't capturing its wholeness, its internal necessity. And the question was about, what can we really do about that internal necessity? Like, what comes from that, right? Because Euclidean geometry is still useful. We use it today and we teach it in high school, really useful for engineering, et cetera, So what gain do you get from putting yourself in the object, as Bergson wrote in his Introduction to Metaphysics? And I think to borrow from Bergson, it's by using his method of intuition that we can rephrase questions to make them right questions. So for instance, the debate between determinism and free will. I haven't read his full book on that, but I was taught that Bergson sort of says the issue is how you're phrasing the question itself and how you're understanding it, because you're understanding it from an external abstract way, right? The way that a Euclidean would be like, oh, I need to find X with lengths of sides 4 and then 5 inches, etc. But through the method of intuition, where we take into account duration, time, change, etc., you can begin to look at the question itself and the difference. And I think this is where Hegel might come in, where you look at what's stopping these two sides, these diametrically opposed, and say, what's the difference here? I was given the image of Hunter of two neighbors fighting over a fence, and you look at the fence itself. So that's what I have to add right now. But what is intuition, or how does one do intuitive knowing?
That was my big question with Bergson is, he says this intuition, but what does that mean? And, to support your connection with this in Hegel, at the very end of section 53 on page 34, Hegel's been again talking about, well, I think he's actually poking at Kant, because he keeps talking about this table of contents and these tables. I think he's talking about Kant's categories, and he's like, Kant, you've got these nice fixed categories, but that's not really the way it works. But then he goes on at the end, at the bottom of page 33, talking about, now this is what scientific cognition does. And then at the top of 34, he says, however, sunken into the material and advancing in that material's movement, knowing returns back into itself, but not before the fulfillment or the content takes itself back into itself, simplifies itself into determinateness, reduces itself to one aspect of an existence, and passes over into its higher truth. By this movement, the simple whole, surveying itself, emerges out of the wealth in which its reflection seems to be lost. And in the context, it seems like he's saying, this is how you do scientific knowing. But it's the same question I have for Bergson. What the hell does that mean? I mean, it's like, here's the dialectical method. You have to sink yourself into the material and advancing in the material's movement. It's like somehow you have to merge with the becoming of the, I just don't know what that means. I mean, maybe the rest of the phenomenology is actually supposed to take us through that process, but at this point, I just don't know what he means.
You have to take acid, basically. No. Yeah, I think that's really similar what Bergson is doing with Hegel, except there's some interesting key differences there. Definitely, okay, so intuition for Bergson is this kind of coinciding with the object of knowledge, a kind of resonance with it, but it's something that is immediate. Obviously, it's intuition, although I think the way that we would see intuition, the way that Hegel uses the idea of intuition, it's very different from what Bergson is saying. And Bergson had some reservations about actually naming it intuition. They can kind of see why. But the idea, though, for Bergson is that it's something immediate. It's not simply a perspective on something, but it coincides with it in this non-conceptual manner, but that it informs then how you would reflect on it or conceptualize about it. So he talks about an actual dialectic in creative evolution of moving between intuition, where you get a sense of something and its movement or whatnot, and then you move from that to reflection, analysis, linguistic description, whatever, and then you check back with intuition and say, okay, well, they're not exactly working together. So I think that's one thing that is interesting about that, is that Hegel, though, is saying something very similar in terms of we have to coincide with our object of knowledge's self-movement, and see kind of how we actually have a sort of resonance between us as the subject of experience that knows, and the object that we're trying to understand. But the difference is that Hegel is saying that this is done actually through concept, through something that's not immediate but is mediated. So that movement is about mediation rather than this immediate coinciding with the object. So I'm not exactly sure how to try to reconcile those two, or how they work exactly. I don't know if I really should try to do that anyways, but it seems like that's one of the big things that at least holds me back from understanding Hegel, in the sense that seems kind of false to me. I guess this idea that it would work through concepts. I don't know. It seems like Bergson, his idea makes a little more sense, in that there's this kind of difficult to describe because it is something intuitive. It is something immediate and experiential and singular and whatnot. That it's hard to describe that, and that's why language is so inadequate a lot of the times to try to describe our experience. So there's always a kind of asymmetry between those two things. That just makes sense to me. But the idea that, I think Hegel would kind of agree with that there's these differences, but that's kind of a fault that we have to kind of overcome by working with those, differences, conceptual differences themselves. So I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but I think it's a really interesting comparison of Hegel and Bergson, and the way that trying to work out, the immediate and the mediation, all these things. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Sean?
Your hand was up.
I was wondering, since Eric was unmuted, if you wanted to go, but if not, I can go.
Oh, I was gonna point to something Nevitt and Jackson were, earlier. So I know that, like, one of the things that Hegel accuses Kant of, and not just Kant, but basically everybody that came before him, was being guilty of what he calls Verstehen philosophy, which is understanding philosophy, and he contrasts that with what he takes to be reason philosophy. And so he thinks this is being, like, it's a development, and Kant did so many things, earth-shattering things in the world of philosophy, but he didn't take it all the way, in part because he was tethered by this notion of understanding, where knowledge is basically fixing concepts. And I don't know if it was earlier in the preface or if it's in the logic. He uses the analogy of dissecting, like wanting to know the human body. So you take a dead corpse and you dissect it to bits. Like, that teaches you something, but it doesn't teach you what you really want to know about how the human body functions. And for that, you need to see one in its dynamic movement, right? And so I think that, that's just a general analogy for his different approach to philosophy, and what he accuses Kant of is basically, fixing these concepts into static forms, forever shall they remain, and his thinking is things never remain static. And then in terms of like, making sense of how like this, sinking yourself into the object in order to know how to proceed with it. I think he's really, really stressing here that only like, it's debatable whether we can just, whether we can talk about a Hegelian method, right? If there is such a thing as a Hegelian method, it's a very, very minimal thing. And it consists in imminent critique. It is this, like you hold the object before you and you do with it what it demands of you, unique to itself as an object. And I'll just kind of like, I think the phenomenology will demonstrate this. You'll see that there are different kinds of relationships and transitions and sublations that occur according to, what the object is that we're investigating. Just in the logic, he looks at pure being, and then this vanishes into nothingness. And so there's a dialectic relationship there that it pertains only to pure being. When you move up a ladder, a rung on the ladder, and you get to determinate being, there's a new dynamic and a new dialectic relationships where the things do not vanish into each other at all. And so it's a strictly, and Hegel sees this as a consequence of the concept that he holds before him. He's not trying to apply a monolithic dialectical method where, you just, posit a thesis, you posit an antithesis, there you have your, your dialectical interplay, and then you use your speculative reason to come up with a synthetic union of the two, because that's, that may not work with certain things, right? Certain things with a posited antithesis, it's not clear what that antithesis would be, if there, if there's one opposite, or if it's more proper to think of it as having triangulated with two, so it's not, what many people have accused him of is just applying a method, a dialectical method to everything, because he's quite the opposite. He's really wary of method. And that's, again, part of his attack on using the mathematical model for philosophy, because when you do mathematics, you go, okay, I'm adding two-digit numbers. I know how to do that. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. You know how to do it. You apply the same method every time. And when you do philosophy and you want to know what freedom really means, you don't do the same thing with freedom that you did with causality or with contingency. Well, actually, freedom and contingency are strongly related, but you see my point. You don't, you're going to analyze substance, and the problems with conceptualizing substance and trying to come with a clear account. How you go about doing that is going to be so different from how you do that with freedom, for example.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. So I've like, because I wanted to respond to things Nevitt, Jackson, Chase, and now Eric have all said. So now I'm totally thrown to the wind, as it were. One of the things that I was just going to mention offhandedly, just because I still think it's funny, is one of the things that Dr. Lewis said about my thesis, like kind of when I was still in the process of making it, is she called it an imminent critique. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know that it was a concept related to Hegel. So when Eric mentioned it just now, I just remembered back to when I found out that imminent critique was a term that Hegel uses to describe sort of his methodology. And I like had this like aha moment where I was like, oh wait, you telling me that Dr. Lewis was telling me my thesis was Hegelian? I don't know how I feel about that. I do think that there's something in particular interesting to this concept of like being able to address something directly and then watching like things within it emerge that ultimately transform it. I kind of wanted to maybe, since we were talking about like needing examples, the one that was coming to my mind, which might or might not be a very helpful one, was like the history of philosophy, particularly as it's sort of starting with Socrates. And I think in particular that, one of the things that Rick Roderick mentions about Socrates in terms of his like project in the city of Athens is that like the Socratic project wouldn't be possible if the confidence that the city of Athens had about many concepts that were very important to them hadn't been shaken by things like loss in the Peloponnesian War, right? The idea here being that like if there's clarity, if there's sort of mathematical clarity within a culture, then we can discover what words like courage or beautiful or good or just mean by this kind of enunciation of like a dictionary definition effectively, right? And so there are clear, discrete, definitive things that we can say about these words, and we can come to the conclusions about them through a process of an investigation about, for instance, in a linguistic sense, about how the word justice is used when it's deployed by Athenians, say in a court of law, right? We can analyze the way that the word is said, and then we can learn what the word means by that process of discovery. But it seems like what the Socratic project did wasn't just a process of discovering what the word justice meant in a strictly in the strict sense of discovering what people meant by it, but like a process whereby we can investigate the word and we can maybe discover what it would mean if it meant certain things. Now, the other example of this that, or like the other sort of, I don't know, this is simultaneously like a contrasting account, but maybe like a helpful way to think about it, is the way that there's this sort of Confucian clarification of names, right? So you know, Confucius comes along and he has this idea that if you know, you have this word prince or governor or whatever, and that word has a particular meaning. And you know, and for Confucius, you know, it means that like a governor is you know, enforces the laws, you know, he pays his dues, he's traditional, he respects the right authorities. If you have a governor who doesn't do that, then by Confucius's standards, he says that that's not a governor, right? But he does kind of allow this like ambiguity where he basically says, look, it could be that we mean something different by the word governor, right? Like we mean something other than this definition that I'm providing. If so, that's fine, right? We can just mean something else by this word governor. We can give it a different definition. Then that's not what I'm talking about, right? And so I think this is what I think insofar as we can point to like an historical precedent. So like when Hegel is saying this is what philosophy is, what can we point to in the history of philosophy that really says this? I think it is really like the Socratic investigation of the meaningless of terms, right? It is this willingness to say, I don't necessarily know what the word beauty means, or I don't necessarily know what the word justice means, and so we're gonna develop some sort of procedure to discover that. But that discovery process is going to run into some of the things that Eric was mentioning in terms of like problems with concerns about our methodology, or I'm thinking of some of the critiques that kind of come up more in a Marxist context. So yeah, I think that was everything I wanted to say. Oh, I think there was one other thing. I wanted to point to a couple of definitions. I forget exactly where these were, but I remember noting them down while I was listening. Because I liked some of the ways that Hegel sort of described this sort of mathematical procedure. So he talked about fixed and dead propositions. Knowing doesn't mean except through equality. He calls magnitude conceptualist difference, inequality, abstract and lifeless unity. And I thought all of those were very like helpful in terms of like unpacking these things for me when I was writing down these definitions. That what it means to say that two things are equal is to say essentially that they not that they're united in a complementary way, that they're interacting with each other, but that they're united through just being identical, just being the same thing, and there not being any sort of differences between them. I found that helpful. I thought this concept of conceptless difference being magnitude. So this idea that there can just be variations on the same idea that aren't meaningfully distinct, but and I feel like that happens a lot in logic, right? Is that once you've established your axioms, you arrive at this moment where there's just that you're realistically just saying the same thing over and over again. I feel like all the tautologies are like this. Like all the tautologies ultimately aren't saying anything in a logical context, because they are ultimately just the same concepts worded differently. So they seem to have that same sort of conceptless difference to them, that they're just differences of magnitude, and they aren't actually saying any new content. And that seems to be what logicians like about them, because you can then generate them ex nihilo, right? The whole thing that I remember in McKinney's class, she would get, and it excited me too, where she would go up there and like, you don't even need any premises to derive this. This is because it's just a tautology. You can you could postulate the premise, but then you can cross it out, and then you just have the pure tautology. It's like, but like when you think about it, it just means that it doesn't mean anything. It's just empty. Anyway, so sorry, that was a lot of rambling. I'll shut up now, but I hope I covered or said some things interesting.
I don't have anything to say regarding what Sean just said, besides what they talked about with Socrates. So if anyone has something more relevant before I go into a sort of non sequitur, here's some time. Here's the escape. Okay. So I think it might be useful to go over what Hegel thinks about the negative, right? Because I saw that talked about in the chat. And one way that I think about it, at least, and I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, is about apophatic theology, perhaps. And this was during the Middle Ages, and it was, what can we say about God? We can only say what we can't say about God. So God is not an ant, is not this or that. And I think that's somehow similar to how Hegel sees the negative, perhaps, and maybe I'm just all mistaken. But even when you say what something's not, and I understand that Hegel's term negative isn't just negation, like, oh, the -2, -3, but that something is posited by even when you say what it lacks. And so with Socrates, I typed in earlier that term aporia, because in trying to search for what justice is and putting something in the machine and seeing if it works, no thrasymachus, it isn't just doing whatever you want, because you have X, Y, Z. It's constant failure, which I think fits Hegel's sublation, where in the system that you have, oh, there's a contradiction. And so therefore we get non-Euclidean geometry from the theorems and axioms of Euclidean geometry. And let's see. And so because we can't get a constant thing posited, we can only say, okay, so it's not sense certainty, it's not Euclidean geometry. And then we keep moving to other systems. That's the way that I've been thinking about it right now. So just a subjective view on that.
Yeah, so I think the Socrates connection, I think, is pretty relevant. And there's a lot of that in Hegel that he's kind of developing. So one thing that I think it connects with that is interesting. So actually, I read Hegel's section on Socrates in his History of Philosophy. Yeah, that was it. Because he says some interesting things about Socrates that Kierkegaard also adapts in one of his first books, The Concept of Irony, in case you're interested in that fun fact. What he says is interesting because he sees Socrates as one of these world historical figures, in the sense that he changed the way that self-consciousness and universality worked. So what he says about Socrates and okay, so ancient Greece, Athens, people didn't necessarily make a lot of, there are certain decisions that people would not make individually, and they were relegated to the community in this way that is hard for us to understand now. They didn't have this sense of individual freedom about all their decisions in the way that we do now as, you know, democratic, rational Enlightenment figures or whatnot. So a lot of what the ancient Greeks did is they used divination and things like that to make decisions that were too important for individuals to make. So a lot of things, it'd be like, should I go to war with, with this person or whatever? If it was a very important decision, they thought that that was too much for an individual to make, and they would basically just not make the decision. And it was seen as, part of the social codes kind of tying the community together, that the individual wasn't responsible for something like that. And that includes almost all of their ethical codes were based on this idea that individuals, first of all, don't make those decisions. The immortal gods do. That's where we got our social rules from. And you don't reflect on them and question them in this individual manner. But what Socrates did was exactly that. He said that instead, no, those things, those values that we get, from the gods or whatnot, these simple universals, say like piety and what is justice, all those things. Instead, they have to be critically reflected on by the individual, but it's not the individual in this solipsistic manner, not solipsist, sophist manner, that it's purely subjective. Instead, what's interesting about Socrates, according to Hegel, is that as an individual, he uses a kind of reason that can be universal, that it can communicate with other people in this way that isn't self-enclosed, but actually is open to this kind of, movement towards the universal, that I can use reason in this way that transcends, just simply my own understanding of something. So he thought that he was this world historical figure that kind of set this in motion from a kind of, simple collective universality where there's no individual freedom necessarily. He changed that to where suddenly there's this burden on the individual to critically reflect back towards a universal understanding of something. So that's what Hegel sees about that. It's interesting, but also this is also self-consciousness being developed, in the sense that, okay, first there's consciousness, but then that kind of critical reflective moment is exactly this, a reflection, which is the self-consciousness aspect of it. So I think that goes along with what Hegel is kind of saying, where he's saying self-consciousness is, in its act of reflection upon itself, is that the same thing as this movement. And the way that we reflect on something then creates, oh no, you see that there's contradictions, or you see that something, it just isn't right, whatever. That itself is this movement, of all these notions developing themselves and blah, blah, blah. So I think that helps make sense of this idea that he's saying that self-consciousness, reflection, and even then negation, critical reflection, like the way that Socrates did, that is part of what is going on with the kind of overall sort of vision that Hegel's presenting, in the sense of that's how these things develop out of themselves. How you have, Socrates, this Greek guy, thinking through basically a lot of, it's interesting because he's actually using a lot of their own ideas, the Greeks' own ideas, almost against themselves in a way. If you read the Apology and things like that, where he says basically, I'm actually the one who's following the rules exactly. I didn't break the rules really, but that's kind of what made him break the rules. So he kind of through his own self-conscious reflection and carrying out these imminent, logical rules or whatnot of the society, develops past them in this way. So yeah, I think that Socrates aspect that's really important to Hegel, and it gives a good example of it too. So
So,
yeah.
Kate, I have a question for you, Chase. So, with regard to this idea of negation, I'm trying to figure out. So, where does that fit in there in that story about Socrates? Would you say, is it that Socrates, in a sense, negates this social mode of decision making? That his focus on individual decision making is then a negation of that mode? Is that how you would use that word, negation?
Yeah, and so it's also kind of the way that so his method is essentially the what is the term for it? The midwifery method. So what he does is he'll get someone to say something like, okay, what is piety? Okay, it's with the God's love, whatever, something stupid. What he'll do then is show that there's a contradiction there. He makes the person who's presenting this stupid universal definition contradict themselves, and that, I think, is what he is part of that negation of leading. So it then leads towards this aporia, this blockage. I think that's also, to a certain degree, what he means by a kind of negation. And Hegel is critical, actually, of Socrates, that he doesn't develop a kind of positivity out of that negativity, because a lot of what Socrates does is simply shut down people's assumed ideas that they have universal, immediate knowledge of these universal truths or whatnot. And I think part of that, the way that he's able to present a kind of critical reflection on those contradictions, that's kind of what that negation of self-consciousness is to Socrates / Hegel. And then it took Plato, of course, to develop the positive sort of movement towards trying to develop all that stuff. But Kierkegaard said that basically Plato fucked up. So he likes that Socrates was all about negativity. He has like this awesome expression. What is it, like pure infinite negativity or something, to describe what he liked about Socrates, that he's all negative, and then Plato just ruined everything, of course, like he always does. Plato sucks. So yeah, hopefully that kind of answers it. Honestly, I'm not really totally sure what Hegel really means by negation either. That's probably the idea that is probably the hardest for me to still understand. I have like some vague kind of hints of it, but I still need to learn that definitely more myself.
Maybe the term negation, as Hegel uses it, is only appropriate for philosophy, because one thing that I got from this week's reading, taken as a whole, was contrasting what Hegel's project is versus the natural sciences, right? Because the first part is heavily like, this is what math does, and this is why it isn't actually philosophy. And so I think it makes sense that with the sciences, you don't really see that Socratic irony / infinite negation or whatever Kierkegaard said, because it's just, okay, let's test out if gravity is indeed 9.8 meters per second squared. It is. You never really see, if a theorem fails, you don't really mind it anymore. You leave it. Sort of what Plato did, perhaps, with his Socrates, like you mentioned, is that for instance, the Euthyphro, right? Euthyphro throws out one definition. Socrates says that's stupid, and then they move on. They don't really sublate, perhaps, anything from the previous postulation. They just sort of leave it like a dead husk. And I think that's similar in the natural sciences, right? Because let's see, what's a theorem? Aristotle's physics, right? We mentioned that before. He didn't think up inertia. What a nerd, what an idiot. And so trash it all away, and now we have cool physics where gravity is constant, at least here on Earth. So maybe that's one way to conceive of negation, is that it's really philosophical and there's not going to be a ready-made example with the natural sciences, which we're really used to, right? These intuitions that we have.
So here's a complication. I mean, I'm just, like, again, talking way beyond what I actually know, but I'm thinking of some things in science so that actually do sound a bit Hegelian. So, you know, I don't know the dates on this or the names, but when people figured out that light acts like waves, you know, that it behaves like a wave, then scientists reason there must be some medium that is waving, because, you know, you don't have water waves that are just waves, you've got water waving. And so if light is a wave, there must be some medium that is actually waving, like the water. And they called that medium ether. And then, I'm not sure when this was, late 19th, early 20th century, maybe? Is it the Michelson-Morley experiment? I'm not sure. But anyway, these guys, they set up this test. They figured if the Earth was moving through the ether, then there would be some stuff you could do. I don't remember. But anyway, they tried to, that light should travel at different speeds depending on where you were, where the Earth was around the sun. And they did this experiment, and it turned out that there wasn't any difference. And they were like, oh, look, there is no ether. And I don't know, again, I don't know how legitimate that is as an example, but at least, you know, you've got this, you posit this, you discover this phenomena, you discover a feature of it, and then that feature posits something like the ether, and then you do this experiment, and then you, no, there isn't any ether, and then you lose that. And so I don't know. I mean, I just wonder. And then, like, you know, well, light acts like a wave, but then if you ask wave a particle question, it acts like a particle. Oh, so it's a wave kind of, but not really. And so, you know, maybe, I don't know. I think, well, I was going to say Deleuze, since Deleuze doesn't talk about Hegel, he probably would not give Hegel credit. But I'm thinking, since, you know, Deleuze, I think, from my vague recollection, puts his fingers in just about everything, including contemporary science. I don't know if he would give any kind of credit to these sorts of movements as Hegelian or not.
A good rule of thumb is that Deleuze doesn't want to credit Hegel with anything, but except bad things. But that's because he actually kind of respects Hegel as an enemy. So there's people that you're opposed to that aren't really even worth being an enemy. That's kind of a Nietzschean idea, but really there's a respect to the rival idea like that. Who's that for Deleuze? It's Kant and Hegel mainly. Those are the enemies that I think he respects, although he doesn't. Yeah, that's kind of a different issue. But one thing I think is interesting about this idea about science in particular is, okay, so what Jackson was saying basically, yeah, there's a certain degree where science is kind of static, and it's, you know, it has this idea of a kind of methodological rigor that it sort of traps it within a kind of static mode of external evaluations and whatnot. And it's kind of interesting that there are also essentially these kind of social forces, I guess I'll say social economic forces that that kind of keep it within this rigorous system. so this Heidegger talks about this in, I think, the Age of the World picture, where he talks about scientific rigor as something like that it's keeping it according to this kind of static internal logic. But the thing is that, and also I've heard that, so one of my friends is a nuclear chemist, and she said that she will often get data that doesn't make any sense. It contradicts basically expectations, and that just, it's kind of an open secret that just about every scientist gets this, and they just simply don't record it. They'll just throw it out. It doesn't fit with the, the system of knowledge or anything like that. How are you going to explain this one anomaly? You don't. You just fucking throw it away. Don't deal with it. Forget it happened. But then, still there is this kind of movement of science. It's obviously changing and whatnot. To a certain extent, it does seem like there is some kind of internal movement to it. But then also, I think Hegel's right in the sense that there's also some aspects where it isn't this, self-moving, imminent logic system, but is kind of doing these external evaluations that keep it static. But the parts that do seem to move science in a lot of ways are non-scientific. They're usually social, they're political, all these different things. So, oh God, what's his name? The guy who talks about paradigm shifts in science. Somebody help me out. Kuhn, thank you. Yes. So yeah, I think his point that, okay, a lot of these, scientific paradigm shifts are actually are not really scientific. That, a lot of times for something to actually take a hold in science, it requires basically one generation to die. Basically, the boomers have to die so the millennials can take over and have their own stupid notions. So and then Generation Z will, of course, kill us millennials and whatnot, probably pretty soon. Oh, the goddamn TikTok or whatever. But yeah, I think I'm not exactly sure what Hegel would make of how, in some cases there's this imminent movement within science. Kind of, I think that example of Euclidean geometry moving to non-Euclidean geometry that Eric pointed out, I think that's a good example of something like that. But then also that in some cases it is something outside of science that has to kind of break up its own kind of external limited ideas of, its own internal logic that is static, that is stuck in this idea, and it requires something else to kind of come in and that's this adjacent point and kind of break it up and get it to move in some way. So yeah.
And this is just in my notes because this is what question I wanted to ask the group, was that and let me see if I'm reading this right, because sometimes my notes, my mind wanders, so forgive me, but if the negation is the process to almost show like an artificial idealism for him, since there seems to be this almost mystic, quasi-mystic Hegelian system of like spirit or oneness, which negation is like an artificial sense of that idealism, where the spirit is the ultimate aspect of that idealism, which has to be viewed as almost like a humanity hive mind or history or experience, so to speak. I don't know if that was a good way to even interpret negation, but that was one of the things that came to mind. Sorry, am I on mute again? Nope. Haha.
Oh, were you gonna go, Eric?
Your hands up, Sean.
Okay. God, what was I going to say though? I kind of got distracted with what Joseph mentioned. Now I'm kind of mulling it over. About science. I did want to specifically say the sense that I get, I don't know if this would have been true in Hegel's day, but I think it's true in our day with respect to science, is that within science, there are sort of both conservativizing like structurers who want to say that science as it presents itself is like sort of almost nearly complete. And so, thought ultimately needs to be like conservatized and kept in this way that I think Hegel would be very critical of. And then there are also people who seem to be aware, and I get the sense of this, like, I feel like the first person I really encountered who like I could point to that I really think thinks this way, in this way that Hegel would approve of, is this biologist, I guess he's like an evolutionary biologist, and he's kind of anyways, Sapolsky, who I think I've brought up before, and I've mentioned him, but I get the sense that he has this, he is aware enough of the history of science to know that there's this, like, that science has this capacity to elude or break out of the boxes that we might attempt to sort of put it into. And so a big part of like the way that he presents his methodology is this idea of like, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll teach the boxes, and then what I will demonstrate is the way that each of the boxes fail. And that leads you to this sort of, I think what I'm interpreting is like kind of a quasi-Hegelian realization of like of the inability of any of these boxes to make sense, right? And the fact that that all of the considerations that the boxes are bringing forward, it's not even just like that all the boxes are connected. It's that you kind of need to like be able to think about biology, be able to think about it as a science without making use of these boxes. But then the only way to really learn about it is to teach the people the boxes, and then teach them the way that they're interconnected. And then hopefully that leads you to the ability to understand what's going on in biology, that in a way that transcends those boxes. And so I get that there's like, I mean, that's an example of how it would work in terms of like the actual knowing of biology. But I also get the sense that he recognizes that this has to be true about what the processes of science are doing themselves, right? That like, it has to be possible for us to be surprised by what we learn about biology through our investigations of it, and for it to open up new possibilities. But I also get the sense that that there is a strong movement to conceive of science as a kind of orthodoxy. I feel like we can think about that in terms of like some of the ways that the new atheists talked about science, I think in particular were particularly bad in that respect. All right, that's good for me.
Yeah, Sean, you basically made one of the points I was going to make, right? I would contest the notion that paradigm shifts come from outside science. I think Hegel and Kuhn would both say that the paradigm shifts come because of developments within science, but it seems today like that it must come from outside science because of the way science is very popular, conceptualized as like a dead body, or accumulation of facts that just keeps getting bigger until it's complete, and then we're done, and then there's no questioning it, which is insane to me. But that speaks to our political culture and our stupid culture war and absurd positions that people work themselves into because they don't know any better, but they have an axe to grind. And in terms of the, I was going to say, yeah, to Joseph's comment on negativity. And then Nevitt wrote the helpful comment there in terms of the mystical reading of Hegel. It's very unpopular today. But I was going to say, I'm still struggling with Hegel's notion of negativity, to be honest. But like, I've done a little bit extra work here, so I'm maybe a little bit further along. I might be able to help. I don't know. But nice. I want to say, for Hegel, negativity is like half of every union. I mean, that's a very simple. As soon as you simplify it, you find problems with that, formulation of it. But when Hegel starts the logic, he starts with pure indeterminate being, and here, you brought up Parmenides earlier, and this is important. I think Hegel, in the logic, and then a bit here in the beginning of the Phenomenology, kind of uses Parmenides is a bit of a stepping stone, right? And explicitly in the logic, he accuses Parmenides of what Parmenides posits like pure being, and then he says actually he doesn't, because he distinguishes it right away from nothing, which is described as a lack of being. But insofar as he's had a distinction between being and nothing, then the being he's posited is not pure being. The being that Hegel posits is pure being without any determination, right? And then what you see is, what is pure being without any determination? What does that describe? That describes nothing, right? Then you're left with nothing. And so this is Hegel demonstrating that it's not determinate being. Determinate being doesn't vanish into nothing, but pure being vanishes into nothing. But then as soon as you look at nothing, pure imminent nothing, you realize that there's something to it, and conceptualizing it in the place that it takes in, once the pure being is vanished. So there's at least something to pure nothing. So now we have these reciprocal vanishing into the two, which is then, synthesized or subblated into becoming, and if you think of, and it's really the only way to conceptualize becoming. And he also talks about how, making the beginning of the book with this, notion of becoming is really important, right? So his system starts with being, nothing, slipping into each other until they become becoming. They stabilize into becoming, and it's from becoming that we get determinate becoming. Now, determinate becoming is essentially its quality, right? So being with a determination, and then immediately it implies a negative, a negation, right? So and just again, this is me simplifying. It probably is not doing justice, but becoming red already implies something not red, right? So it's Hegel's working through what it means to think something already implies thinking something that is like a mirror negative, right? But what he's trying to say is this pervades all of our thought, right? And going back to Jackson's here. He was talking about negative theology earlier, and it reminded me again. Hegel makes this point in the logic. If you take Parmenides as pure being and you try and import that into theological writing or argument, that it leads to, what is it, the cosmological argument, right? That God is pure being and perfect and all that. Hegel insists God can't be pure being, because if God was pure indeterminate being, then that would mean that God is nothing. And you started with God being pure being, and now you end up with God being nothing. So Hegel insists that if you're going to conceive of God, the cosmological proof is wrong, but if you're going to conceive of God, you have to have negativity, at least in the form of determinacy. Otherwise, you just have, again, nothing. So for Hegel, like, negativity is constitutive, I think, of every, is a constituent part of every kind of ultimate identity. Again, I don't know all the details, and I feel like I have more to learn to flesh out how this concept works, but maybe a little bit further on just from that part of the logic, if that helps.
Yeah, I think those questions about mysticism and whatnot are pretty interesting, especially that they are, I think, undervalued. But so I think what Hegel in a lot of ways is doing that people tend to downplay is that he's talking about God in this book and everything, basically. And a lot of his ideas come from this. So we read Schelling's The Ages of the World. He was talking about something similar. Okay, basically this book is about how God has to basically alienate himself, itself, whatever, and then kind of come back to knowledge of itself through self-reflection, in order to actualize this understanding of God for himself or whatnot. So it's very theological. And the thing is that because it's not just theological in the sense of, a kind of maybe like a faith or something like that, but it's also something that is, logical to Hegel. It doesn't necessarily need to have the religious sort of discourse or interpretation kind of to go with it. So people can separate, the other aspects of Hegel away from that. And that's what almost everybody does, according to my knowledge. It seems like a lot of Hegelians now are atheist and materialist, which I think is kind of hilarious, but also maybe appropriate to Hegel in a sense. That's probably also somewhat to the influence of Marx, probably, but I think the mystical aspect of Hegel is pretty important, and also in the sense, okay, I think what he's getting a lot of these ideas from essentially mystics who have revelatory intuitive experiences, which I think is kind of interesting and maybe poses some problems for Hegel to kind of explain what's going on there. Jakob Böhme, who was a huge influence on Schelling and Hegel, and basically invented dialectics, essentially. He basically invented dialectics based off a moment of revelation where he saw a reflection of light in a pewter dish that basically explained to him the dynamic nature of God, and from that he realized basically that God unfolds in this dialectical manner, and he was a huge influence on Schelling and Hegel. They get all of these ideas about dialectics from Jakob Böhme, from this moment of just revelation and whatnot. And it's kind of interesting that he's at the same time so Hegel, though, is very critical of that sort of revelatory intuitive thing. No, you have to give it this logical, explicit objectification, this knowledge. You can't just simply, and also like who was saying, I think, yeah, Eric was saying this, you can't just simply, it doesn't work for Hegel to say, oh, oneness. That doesn't work. And for the same reason that God can't just simply be, oh, I'm oneness. No, there has to be some kind of differentiation or distinction in there, a reflection with something itself, some kind of split within it to give it some kind of idea of itself. And I think that's also what a lot of, this analysis of opposites and then moving past opposites and whatnot, that's part of this process that Hegel's talking about. And it's very much tied to this idea of trying to kind of reflect on how God can know itself and whatnot, and also as this kind of, Spinoza's pantheism kind of in there too, in the sense that he's a panentheist, that he thinks that, spirit, everything that is God, essentially trying to understand what God himself as God is. So I think that's a huge part of it, but at the same time, he's critical of it. I don't know. I think I'd just like to insert something that would go against the grain of, a kind of sort of accepted idea of basically what can be, respectable ideas and what isn't and whatnot. And I think this idea of, a kind of tradition of mysticism basically influencing a lot of philosophy is one of those ways to show that, okay, maybe this isn't just all some kind of, imminent thing, in the sense of, okay, there's just simply this linear progress of scientific thinking, of getting rid of the irrational and the weird stuff, and just simply we're moving towards, you know, reason, we're moving towards truth and all this stuff. And I think Hegel is part of the problem here in a sense. Really, I think there's something else going on that's even influencing Hegel and these other people, or in indirect ways that, I don't know if there's like some kind of normative thing going on where people need to acknowledge this or something, but more I think it's just kind of interesting, I guess, but it has some interesting implications too, and that a lot of these ideas do come in these sudden flashes of that are ridiculous to a certain degree. How do we, you know, try to reconcile that a lot of these ideas that are ridiculous and irrational are nevertheless influencing, you know, pure rationality and whatnot? I don't know. Maybe it shouldn't be reconciled again, but I find it interesting, I guess. So I do kind of want to read this book, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, where he's talking about. So I haven't actually read it, but from what I can tell, it's talking about how Hegel was influenced by Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, and even in the structure of the Phenomenology, there's ideas about a kind of initiation into something that is kind of like the, if you're familiar with the mystery religions of ancient Greece that Plato and whatnot were involved with, Parmenides, it's a similar kind of thing there. So yeah, this stuff is really interesting to me, but probably other people don't really find that interesting. So yeah, I'll stop rambling about it.
You know, one thing I've wondered, I mentioned this last time, and I think maybe somebody said I was wrong, but I'm wondering if so, you know, subjectivity seems to be so crucial for Hegel, and subjectivity, you know, again, maybe I'm wrong, but I get the impression that subjectivity is in some sense constitutive of objects. In other words, I mean, it's not, you know, it reminds me of contemporary phenomenology, but that you don't have objects if you don't have a subject. And so I guess what I'm wondering, and this is kind of, again, just a big question, is one reason that he thinks of God as being, you know, is God the ultimate subject? I guess that's what I'm wondering. And is God the sort of the ground of subjectivity, and therefore the ground of the possibility for there being things? So, you know, I don't know if Hegel thinks of subjectivity as being just the totality of entities that have subjective existence. In other words, for example, all of us and any other kind of being that has subjectivity, or is there some broader category of subjectivity, for example, the deity or something, and maybe you have to have this ground of subjectivity in order for there to be objects. But that's kind of, I just don't know. But that's when we, you know, I don't know. I'm wondering about why, because in this section he says God is being, which I'm thinking, well, then why call it God? You know, I mean, what's the point of having a deity or a godlike being if it's just God is being? But, you know, maybe God is the ground of subjectivity. I don't know.
Maybe something interesting to add on, because we talked about Spinoza at the beginning. I've attempted like 2 times, I think, to read the Ethics, but ultimately I fail because I'm only a man. What can I say? But that Spinoza addresses God as God or nature. So that's sort of similar to what you're saying is, hey, names, that's it.
Yeah, there is a lot of similarities in between him and Spinoza, isn't there? I didn't really think of that till you mentioned it. Good point.
I don't know where it is, but I know that Hegel's very like explicit about this. Like he's basically, what is it? The quote after Spinoza, like everybody is either a Spinozist or not a philosopher. Those are the 2 options, right? So I think that there's certainly, I think Hegel recognizes an affinity there. maybe it's just because I have a very Deleuzian partisan interpretation of Spinoza, but I have I have a feeling that there's going to be some differences between the way that Spinoza and Hegel conceive of God. I think in particular, though, bringing up panentheism, which I believe that was Chase who mentioned that, I think might be interesting here, because there are arguments that Spinoza is a panentheist instead of a pantheist, or maybe in addition to his pantheism. I think that might be interesting, because that's as much as I'm willing to say on that for now, because I'm honestly very confused about what Hegel intends God to be based on what we've read so far. So
I was just going to throw out to Chase's comment. I do think Hegel was very eclectic in terms of his sources for knowledge, and probably would readily acknowledge that he'd read mystics and that those had informed him. But Hegel is not a mystic, expressly because, I mean, especially in the logic, but it's very much the case in the phenomenology too. He thinks that what he has to share with the world is entirely exoteric. Like he wants, he wants to, help reason get to, a clearer understanding of itself by, thinking of things in a specific way that he finds illuminating, or that, and then writing it and sharing it with the world. And the logic is it's almost, I mean, I haven't read the ethics, but it's almost like things are derived one after the other. It's almost like a very stepwise deductive kind of argument, but it's not deductive all the way. It's certainly, there are steps of derivation all the way through. He really wants people to follow the argument all the way through. But more to the point, I think the phenomenology of spirit kind of demonstrates, I think Hegel has an attitude about, well, again, a lot of us who do philosophy might be tempted to think highly of philosophy, right? And to think lowly or not too highly about everyday thinking about, what the mob has to say or what the plebs are talking about or whatever. But part of what he's trying to do in the phenomenology is to demonstrate the value of philosophical thinking without presupposing the value of philosophical thinking, but instead starting with regular, everyday common consciousness and showing how eventually this demonstrates that, that philosophical thinking is superior, and, something you want to do, but it doesn't, is it in the phenomenology? He says you don't win your battles by fighting the enemy where he's not, right? So part of what he's trying to do in the phenomenology is make the case that philosophical thinking is good, and against those people who are not philosophers, who are like, you guys just always have your heads in the clouds and full of abstractions, and what you say has nothing of value for the rest of us. He says, no, I'll show you it has value for the rest of us. Go, sinks down and gets down with the mud and everybody else, and shows how eventually, if you work enough in the mud, then you'll have steps up this ladder and you're not in the mud anymore. Eventually, I guess the point I'm trying to say is that he's trying to demonstrate that high levels of philosophical thinking can be seen as a consequence of, but can be justified by common thinking. But you can't assume that philosophical thinking is superior from the beginning. And so in terms of like his relationship with mysticism, I think he's going to, consciously exclude mysticism as a method, because he's trying to demonstrate. And I think that's part of, mysticism kind of like puts up esoteric knowledge and like secrets, and, like, oh no, you wouldn't understand. You have to be an ascetic for 10 years and suffer before you can even start to understand this stage of our thinking or what have you. And I think Hegel's is like, no, this is all could be completely public, and we can get the commoner to the level of high philosophical theorizing if we start with sense certainty, show its problems, work our way up through perception. And that's, again, the development of the philosophy is supposed to bring you to a philosophical point of view without assuming from the beginning that the philosophical point of view is superior.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty interesting. I definitely agree. Hegel's definitely not a mystic, but it's almost like he's trying to reach the same conclusions to a certain degree, and he's also, like I said, influenced by a lot of mysticism. You know, it's kind of interesting because Schelling seems to be, you know, what is the difference between Schelling and Hegel? It seems to be, it was like Schelling is a mystic, Hegel's not. And that's kind of what Schelling, yeah, criticizes Hegel about, that he's, you know, this dry spirit, that it is this kind of logical thing. It's interesting that he seems to be doing something similar, trying to arrive at something, an understanding of God, essentially, that is, though opposed to a kind of mystical method. Although I'll say, yeah, a lot of mysticism, basically, is that you have to have a kind of, it's almost a sort of technology of the self, Foucault term, but in the sense that you're trying to get yourself to have that revelation, that intuitive jump of gnosis, of knowledge. It's probably easier though than probably 10 years of reading Hegel books. I'll say that. So I think a lot of mystics would say, yeah, that's the suffering of asceticism is probably nothing compared to the suffering of reading Hegel. Or at least maybe I'm projecting my own ideas about that. But still at the same time, I like the suffering, the Hegel suffering more than the ascetic suffering. So I'll probably stick with Hegel myself. But yeah, I think interesting dialectic really between this sort of mysticism informing non-mysticism, and then kind of vice versa. It's kind of, okay, you got Kant, who's, you know, the most non-mystical person probably ever. And then you've got, you know, I don't know about Fichte, who knows? Schelling, mystic, absolutely. And then Hegel, no, I don't know. It's strange. It's very strange. I don't know. Maybe that's like an interesting thing for some further research. I don't know. I really want to read this book now that we've had these discussions. But maybe I actually just wanted to talk so I could give that joke about how reading Hegel is suffering. And I think I delivered it somewhat, although it probably wasn't that funny.
I know we're out of time, but I think Chase brought up an interesting parallel between Hegel and mysticism. And yeah, Hegel isn't a mystic, but I had the pleasure last summer to read Peter Adamson's Philosophy in the Islamic Age. And one current of Islamic philosophy is Sufism, right? The mystic, sort of Kabbalah inspired. And I remember Peter Adamson, I forget the particular philosopher names, but they wrote that the truth of philosophy reaches something like the mystic, but the mystic has a slight advantage or whatever, or that they're both two roads going to the same place. So now I'm really interested in both your book that you brought up, Chase, of Hegel and mysticism, and learning more about mysticism in the Abrahamic phase and seeing what Hegel has to say. So that's all really interesting. That's all.
Yeah, I have a PDF of that. I can post something on the Discord. And yeah, I think so a lot of mysticism is associated with Eastern religion, but there's a whole tradition of Western mysticism, which kind of considered, you know, esotericism or the Hermetic tradition in other cases, that I think is interesting. And there's also connections there with Deleuze for those people who are interested in that. There's actually a book called The Hermetic Deleuze that I've read part of, but I don't exactly totally agree with mysticism, you know, but I think it's very interesting. So, yeah.
Okay, one last thing that I'll say for this recording right here is that I've had more experience in Christian Gnosticism, and I do agree with you, Chase, that there's a majority of parts within it that are just this very holier than thou. I've come across the knowledge, and from this I can postulate that Sophia is this woman, and the Demiurge is this thing, and it's very much a secret club where it's like, I know the truth, the Vatican's and all the other Christians, I had to read for high school, Quo Vadis, Where Art Thou? And that guy was really into Christian mysticism. And I think it would be useful perhaps to make a distinction between mysticism in terms of earnest thinking on things, I guess, to say it simply, versus the whole, oh, I can think up like 50 kinds of demons and angels. I love mythos, but I'm going to disguise it as philosophy.
I know Nevitt had some experience and knowledge with the Christian esotericism or mysticism that is also kind of, yeah, I definitely agree. There's parts of it that are kind of the whole idea of a kind of esotericism has been questioned, but yeah, maybe time for another discussion, I guess, another day, maybe.
I think we can all agree the best angels and demons are Aziraphale and Crowley. So, there's that. I love David Tennant as Crowley. He nailed that role. I mean, I'm a David Tennant fanboy, but man, did I love him in that series.
That was great.
Oh, he was wonderful.
Here's my book show and tell. This book is subtitled The Epistemology of Religious Experience, and it's written by an analytic philosopher, so I'm not sure I should recommend reading it. But I mean, it's just that this guy has an interesting thesis, which is that you can construct an analytic epistemology for mystical experience that is as rigorous as an epistemology for empirical experience. So, he is an analytic epistemologist, and when I read this, I didn't even know what analytic meant, and so it was very confusing. But there's at least one guy who thinks you could do that. It has an endorsement on the back by Alvin Plantinga. So, but anyway, any last parting shots? Okay.
This has been fun. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you. See ya next week, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Oh yeah, come Saturday from 9 to 12 is the movie thing. Okay, I'm gone.
Oh, yeah.
Think of a Chinese
Oh,
booking.
yeah.
Yeah,
Do that.
Thank you.
Is that on Discord?
It'll be on Discord. It works. Bye-bye.